you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression is over.
Hello, and welcome to the Controlled Burns podcast, the weekly hobby list podcast hosted by me, SlowBurne from Wildfire Gaming. Today, I want to talk about one of my favorite entertainment experiences of all time, and one that I think only gets better the more time that I spend with it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Bloodborne, the 2015 video game from Software. Today, I want to dive into my history and experiences with the game, analyze why it works so well for me, discuss why I have actually underrated it in my recent top 25 games list, despite putting it all the way up at number 5 on that list, and of course, rank a few things along the way. I like the idea of doing some episodes devoted to really great things, whether that's great artists or bands, video games, shows, entertainment properties, whatever. I think in some cases I'll have guests on to join me for these quote unquote appreciation podcasts, but for this one, I don't think anyone in my life really loves Bloodborne enough to qualify joining me on this episode. So you're going to be stuck with just me for this one. Of course, if you're interested in writing into the podcast and having your comments or questions read on air, you write into the podcast at controlledburns with an ES at gmail.com. Let me know if there are any specific video games or other entertainment topics that you'd like me to dive into on the podcast on an episode like this. I also want to note that my inexperience with NFL rules did show in my last episode with Brett Fox, where I picked my playoff teams for the NFL, and I went through my predicted bracket. I wouldn't change my team picks. I don't. I want to lock those in. Even though obviously we've seen, as I record this, it's on Saturday night, Well, it's now I guess early Sunday morning, December 1st, 12:15. So we're getting ready for another Sunday football day. And so this last week we saw the Commanders absolutely fail miserably against the Cowboys, and well, I guess that was a couple weeks ago. And then this week they lost to the Eagles. So yeah, I'm not feeling too good about my Commanders pick right now over the Eagles, but regardless, that's locked in. But what I realized is that my bracket, whenever I predicted my playoffs and got really specific, I put it together incorrectly because I matched up some of the top wild card seeds with the number two division winners rather than matching the number two with the seventh seed. So at the end here, after I go through all my Bloodborne stuff, I'm gonna put together an updated bracket based on my playoff picks. So like I said, it doesn't change my picks for the conference or the Super Bowl champions. But it does create some different matchups that will alter how deep I see some teams going in the playoffs. So we'll get into that at the end here. So getting into Bloodborne, even though I discussed it briefly when I was talking about Bloodborne on my top 25 episode, I do want to go over my history with Bloodborne here because it was definitely a grower for me. The first time I played it, which was in March 2018, when it was one of the free games, quote unquote, for PS Plus that month, I did not like it. By the way, I hate calling the PS Plus games free. They are not free. You are paying for that service, but it was a game that was included with the service in March 2018. But yeah, I didn't like it. I remember just trying over and over again to make it down that first street in Central Yarnum, and I just couldn't do it. And beyond that, I kept fighting the axe wielding guy that lives under the stairs. There, you pretty early on Central Yarnum, you go down these stairs, and then you're kind of on the main street there. And if you go left, you can go under the stairs, and there's like this spot where there's this axe wielding guy who's just like way too tough for you at the beginning of the game, unless you're really good. And he was so tough, in fact, that with my inexperience with the game, I actually was convinced that he was the first boss and not just some regular enemy. So I was completely clueless with how this game worked or what the bosses were like, as I never played a From Software game before this, obviously. So it goes without saying, I went in knowing it was supposed to be tough, but I had never struggled with a game like this, and it was really a humbling experience. If you're interested, you can actually go back into the live archives of Wildfire Gaming on YouTube, and you can see this failed session for yourself. It was pretty pathetic. You had to go back to pretty early, obviously going back to March 2018. But if you search up Bloodborne, or if you just scroll back far enough in the archive, you'll find it. But later that night, I discovered a video that would help me greatly, which was Game Informer's 6-hour stream of Bloodborne back from when it launched in I guess I'm not sure if it was March 2015, but early on in 2015. And it just had an all-star cast of some of my favorites from that outlet, including Andrew Reiner, Dan Tack, Tim Turi, and Wade Wojcik. And not only is that entertaining or that video entertaining as hell, it is extremely educational for new players just trying to play the game for the first time, particularly because of the wisdom of Dan Tack there. So by watching that and playing along, I was able to kind of learn the ropes and be set up for success for the remainder of the game. So I returned to Bloodborne that night, and while I didn't defeat any bosses, the bug was kind of set in my brain that this was a game that I wanted to try to conquer. So where I was had what I want to set up a little bit what was going on in my life at this point. So I had recently graduated from college at this time, and I was back living with my mom, working my first job, which was only a part-time job. It was not one of the most glamorous points in my life, quite frankly. But I remember there was one night where everyone left and I kind of had the house to myself. And I took my PS4 downstairs to play on the living room TV. And with that Game Informer video kind of serving as my guide, I just played the hell out of Bloodborne that night. And that was the night where I really fell in love with it. It was like no RPG I'd ever played. It was filled with risk for pushing yourself deeper into treachery at the risk of losing all your souls. But as a result, the payoff for success was just like nothing I had ever felt. And oddly, despite the high stakes, failure was less devastating than what you would expect, and it just served as an incentive to try again. And so, I was hooked from that point on. Um, and in terms of that original playthrough, there were a few other streams I did here and there, but for the most part, I did play it without any distraction. I wasn't streaming the majority of it. And I do think that that was the way to go. So for every new area and every new, just incredibly challenging yet creative boss that I conquered, my appreciation for the game grew. And when I was confused about something, like remember, on online you can kind of see these little ghosts or apparitions wandering around of other players, and you can kind of see what they're doing just for a brief moment in time. And I'd see that people were running around with like this awesome katana blade, and I was like, how do I get that? So I go online and try to find out how to get that. And then I realized there were entire areas I hadn't discovered, like Snowy Castle Canehurst and its hidden blood-tinged Chickage. So a few games in my adult life have been able to instill that sense of wonder. Perhaps in part because at this point I rarely game without some sort of guide at my side, and I don't regret that because with my limited time gaming these days, I was just this week I actually kept track of it for the first time, where I was keeping track of how I spent my free time just by myself, outside of spending time with my wife and family. This is the Thanksgiving week, so it might be a little bit skewed. I was spending a lot of family time, but I got in, and by the way, this isn't counting I did spend some time with my family playing Jackbox on Friday, but outside of that, I had 1 2 hour gaming session this week. So my time is, I do think that's a little bit of an outlier, but it is definitely a lot more limited these days than it was back in 2018 when I was playing Bloodborne. But that's part of the reason that I like to use guides these days, just because I want to make sure that not only am I not missing anything, but I always want to be feeling like I'm making meaningful progress when I play, not just wandering around aimlessly trying to figure out where to go. So, with that said, there is a case to be made that I sacrifice some of that sense of wonder that I felt with Bloodborne. But it's a trade-off that I'm willing to, and it feel like I just kind of have to make at this point. But like many that play a From Software title for the first time, my skills with the game improved dramatically over the course of my time with it. And by the end, I was beating mini bosses like Amygdala, Dark Beast Parl, the One Reborn, and even Murgo's Wet Nurse in one go. Not Gehrman. I did struggle with him for many attempts, but that boss as the end cap to my first playthrough was just so incredible, and I never got frustrated with it. Every time I got to fight him was like a pleasure ultimately, and I did succeed in the end. And because I'd become aware of the secret ending and that's unlocked through the consumption of three of the one-third of umbilical cords, I did go up against the moon presence in my first playthrough. I remember my brother Brandon kind of seeing that, and he really loved it conceptually because it reminded him of the ending twist of Final Fantasy IV, which at that time I hadn't played yet. I have played it now, and I do see the similarities for sure. With the Zeromus, I think it is, at the end of Final Fantasy IV. But on that note, while the story of Bloodborne was pretty much lost on me during that first playthrough, because I certainly wasn't taking the time to read all the item descriptions, it was obvious that the world was, as you go through the game, was descending further into madness as I was unlocking the dark cosmic secrets of the world around me, and it was really quite effective tonally and atmospherically, even not knowing really what was going on. So I can't remember where Bloodborne fell on my all-time list after I finished it for the first time. It definitely wasn't in the top five or anything. But there was no question that it was a special experience that I cherished then. And I knew one day I would likely return to it. And then as it turned out, that day was not so very far away. I played through the game again multiple times in 2019. There was one where I played it by myself, and I believe again alongside Tree Trunk Sean from Wildfire Gaming, who we had on the podcast a few episodes ago, talking about his top 25. It was during this playthrough. I think it was during the playthrough I was by myself. It's definitely during this period that I bought and I played through the old Hunters DLC, which enhanced my love for the game even more. I think that DLC holds, without question, the best content of the game. Certainly the best bosses, including Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower and Ludwig the Accursed. Um, During 2019, across those playthroughs, I ended up with Maria's Rakuyo and Ludwig's Holy Moonlight Sword on various playthroughs. Both of them remain among my very favorite weapons in any game ever. Alongside the Blades of Mercy, which is also from Bloodborne. Those are all just top tier weapons, I think, in gaming history. It was also during this time that I really got a grasp on the story too, because of I think it's just the case for a lot of us. The Vati Vidya videos on YouTube. He's really great at just kind of going through the stories and uncovering them and kind of deciphering them and explaining them to people for from software games. And he's really done a lot with Elden Ring. He didn't do it as much with Bloodborne as I would have liked, but um, for I think the Souls games and particularly Elden Ring, he's really done a lot of great videos. So I think part of what made this game so special to me was that it is a fairly untraditional RPG in how it doles out the story and characters. But it does do a great job of fulfilling that pursuit of power that makes RPGs some of the most special gaming experiences. I always think back to Final Fantasy VII. When I talk about this, with you go back in Cloud's flashback where you fight alongside Sephiroth, and you could just see how astronomical, in gameplay, and in through the mechanics that you at this point understand how astronomically more powerful he is than you are. And in that moment, you're meant to feel like you could just never, under any circumstance, hope to defeat him. Which is certainly the feeling that I had the first time playing through that game. And of course, that's combined with right around that time, you see the infamous impaling of the Midgar Zalem on that tree that he's left behind for you. By the end of the game, Cloud and his team have become so powerful that not only is beating Sephiroth doable, it really isn't even particularly challenging. I don't think I've ever lost to him in my playthroughs of Final Fantasy VII. Bloodborne does the same thing, but it's not only with your character that's getting more powerful as the game goes on. I think more critically and centrally to the game, it's you as a player that is getting better. It's really amazing going back and watching my first timid forays into the game on those old archive streams compared to what I'm able to accomplish now, where I can routinely go many hours without a single death, including I guess tough areas, bosses, even invasions, and where you have like real players invading you, and then in places like the Nightmare Frontier. And then there were bosses like Father Gascoigne and Vicar Amelia and Martyr Ligarius that just seemed insurmountable during my first playthrough without calling in help. And I just absolutely carve through them now. And even with, new playthroughs with not leveled up characters. In my most recent playthrough, that I'm going to talk about a little bit, Vicar Amelia, she literally didn't even touch me, which is definitely the first time I've ever, I think, faced a boss in Bloodborne where I didn't take any damage at all. During my first time playing Bloodborne, my own skills, I feel like, had advanced from level 1 Cloud to level 50 Sephiroth, and it was an incredible feeling of satisfaction that I don't think has been matched for me in any other video game. So by the end of 2019, Bloodborne ranked even higher among my favorites, and my love for it will continue to grow as I regularly went back to it. In 2020, during the throes of the pandemic, when I had even more time that's probably the most amount of time in my adult life that I had to play video games. I got into PlayStation trophies, thanks in large parts to channels like Mystic and PlayStation Access that were glorifying them. We talked about this in episode 3 of the podcast that was focusing on PlayStation trophies. But after getting my feet wet with some of the easy platinums for games like Spyro and Sly Cooper and Jack and Daxter and Ghost of Tsushima and Skyrim, and some of the more challenging ones like Crash Team Racing, Last of Us Part 2, and Doom, I decided to go for Bloodborne. And by this point, I knew the game so well and was confident in my skills that I wasn't even really intimidated by it. Now, my confidence did get brought back down to earth somewhat, particularly in those chalice dungeons that require you to go through them at half health. including against the bosses. That was that Flame Dog boss. And then there's that rematch with Amygdala that both of them stand out today as some of the toughest challenges I've faced in video games. But ultimately, I did persevere. And in April 2021, I completed my platinum journey through the unlock. My last trophy was the last ending, which was that I had never gotten before, which was the Arnhem Sunrise ending, when you submit to Garamond and allow him to kill your character, and then they wake up and live another day in Yarnum. And that visual of your character waking up and seeing the sunrise, that felt like the perfect end cap to my time with Bloodborne. And it was at that point where it made its way into my top 5 games of all time. So I didn't touch it again for years, really, at that point, after getting the platinum trophy. But it was 3 years later, here in 2024, that I did finally return to it, not just by myself, but with my wife, Reagan, alongside me. This time, not only did I let her pick my character's weapon, which for the most part was the threaded cane until we got to the Moonlight Sword in the DLC. This time we read every item description, which allowed her to kind of experience the story as the devs intended. I didn't tell her what the story was going into it. I wanted her to kind of feel like she was uncovering it herself. And I would even keep notes and give her updated lore sessions based on everything the game had told us up to various points. Now, she didn't walk away from that playthrough anywhere near as satisfied as I was, but by the time I finished, my own love for the game had grown again to the point where I realized that I had actually underrated it during my top 25 discussion on this very podcast. So today, as it stands, Bloodborne now sits comfortably at number 2 on my list, and it is only behind Final Fantasy VII. And while I didn't consider putting it above Final Fantasy VII, I feel Bloodborne has kind of equally distanced itself from the rest of the pack. That it is like pretty locked in as my number 2 right now. It's a very special experience that I think anyone with even a hint of interest in games like this, or that want to challenge themselves in games, or that want to have this sort of unique storytelling experience where it's kind of an archaeological dig into finding out what's going on in the storytelling, should experience this game for themselves. It is truly one of the greatest games of all time. But with that, I want to get into the listing portion of this week's episode, in which I'm going to rank all of the main bosses, the story and DLC. I'm not going to include the chalice dungeons, since it's been too long since I fought those bosses, and I've only fought each of them only once, or as many times as it took for me to beat them. So I'm not gonna play those or rank those, but everybody else that's like in the main game and the DLC, I'm gonna be ranking them twice actually. I'm gonna rank them in terms of quality and then also in terms of difficulty. And I am gonna also rank each of the areas in the game, the levels in the game, and then finally I'm gonna hit you with my top 10 favorite weapons in the game. So I'm gonna go in the order of weapons, areas, bosses by quality, and finally bosses by difficulty. And the difficulty part, I do kind of have that mathematically measured because I did count my deaths during each of the bosses during my most recent playthrough, and that wrapped up just a few weeks ago. So very fresh. So starting with the weapons, this list is obviously highly limited to the weapons that I've actually used, and I'm also limiting this to just the right hand weapons, so the main weapons in terms of firearms. The Evelyn reigns supreme now and forever. But across all my playthroughs of Bloodborne, I've probably used about half of the weapons if I was just going to give you a rough estimate. So it's possible that some of the ones I haven't used would make this list, and I suspect that is probably the case. I tend to gravitate toward the skill weapons more than the strength weapons, so you'll see that reflected here. But there are even some of those, like the skill weapons, that I haven't tried out yet. Part of that is because I now have this core group of weapons that I really love so much, and it's kind of hard to motivate myself to use one of the other ones since I no longer play the game anywhere near as regularly as I used to. But at the same time, I do see myself trying out some of these other weapons, maybe doing like a randomizer of some kind to encourage experimentation in the future. But for now, I want to start by disclosing the weapons I haven't used, and they are the Amygdalan Arm, the Beast Claw, the Bloodletter, Boomhammer, Burial Blade, Church Pick, Cost Parasite, Logarius Wheel, Rider Palash, Stake Driver, and Whirligig Saw. So those are the weapons I have not used. Now let's go on to my top 10 favorite weapons of the ones that I have used. So number 10 on my list is the Kirk Hammer. This is a weapon that was my main during the majority of my first playthrough of Bloodborne. I did end up replacing it toward the end with the Chikage, which almost certainly wasn't operating at max potential, given that I had spec for the Kirk Hammer for the majority of the game. But what drew me into this weapon was that Game Informer video I mentioned earlier. All the guys were just absolutely drooling over this thing to hilarious effect. There's a moment where So when they get the weapon, Dantak is playing because he's the most familiar with the game, and he knows that that's the weapon that he wants to use at that early stage. So they transition from the axe to the Kirkhammer as soon as they unlock it from defeating the cleric beast. And Tim Curry and Reiner have never seen it before, so they're just like drooling over this thing. And then a little bit later on, Tim Curry finally gets his hands on it, and there's like this hilarious moment where he just like smashes the hammer into the ground for the first time, and he goes, "Oh yeah!" And I still say that to this day. I just think it's so funny. But that said, I got my fill with the Kirkhammer on that first, 3/4 of a playthrough, and I've never really felt the desire to go back to it. Its ability to mix a fast and heavy weapon is very cool, and it's certainly versatile. But at the end of the day, there are just many more weapons in Bloodborne that I find more stylish and that kind of fit my go-to play style better. So number 9 on my list is the Saw Cleaver and the Saw Spear. I kind of put them together here because they have essentially the same move set, and whichever one you use is basically determined by whether you're specking more into strength or skill. Generally, as a result of that, I have used the Spear more just because it is easily accessible for free in Central Yarnum, which I do think sort of disincentivizes players from choosing the Cleaver. At the same time, I do think the harder edged look of the cleaver is kind of cooler, and I do consider it sort of the quintessential Bloodborne weapon since it was used in all of the marketing leading up to the release. The serrated blade of both weapons makes it excellent for early game when most of the enemies are beasts, which take extra damage from serrated weapons. Vicar Amelia is probably the best use case for that outside of the obviously the cleric beast at the very beginning. But that utility does kind of wear off as the enemies get more varied later on in the game. And like the Kirkhammer, there are just plenty of other weapons I gravitate to more. That said, though, it is rare for me to not at least have the spear equipped as sort of a backup weapon for me as I go through Central Yarnum, no matter what my build is, just because you get it so early and for free. Moving on to number 8 here is Ludwig's Holy Blade. This weapon is very similar to the Kirkhammer, and I think actually the thin, the untransformed blades moveset is actually exactly the same. But I do prefer the range and sort of the wide swipes of the greatsword to the Kirkhammer's sort of more blunt attacks. And it just looks way cooler than the Kirkhammer, in my opinion. The amount of detail work that went into the transformed blade is really impressive from an art perspective, and I do think the lore behind it as Ludwig's chosen weapon, until it's replaced by a more celestial option, is really cool. Number 7 on my list is the Beast Cutter. This was the first weapon in the DLC that's accessible enough, and it's so accessible that you can sort of dip in and grab it as soon as it's available after defeating Vicar Amelia, which is not whenever you should be going to the DLC proper. By no means are you ready for it at that stage, but you can kind of dip in and grab the Beast Cutter if you want and use it for the majority of the game. Essentially, it's sort of like a heavy version of the threaded cane. It may swing slow, but it does pack one hell of a kick. The sound design of the weapon is just fantastic. I don't think there's a weapon with greater range in the game as well, so there is some utility there. I'm not too crazy about the untransformed like club version of the weapon, and even the transformed weapon. It is a little slow. It's maybe a bit too slow for my taste. But there's no question this is one badass piece of weaponry, and it has plenty of utility, whether it's as a backup or a main weapon. So very cool. Number 6 on my list is the Chikage. So kind of mentioned him here, but my favorite villain of all time, as well as one of my favorite just characters ever, is Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. So anytime I have the ability to use a katana, I'm generally quite interested. This was particularly the case during my first playthrough of Bloodborne, at which point I was only about a year removed from my first playthrough of Final Fantasy VII. So as soon as I found out about the Chikage and like I mentioned earlier, from those online ghosts that I was seeing running around, I had to get my hands on it. So even though the stats used for it are completely different from the Kirkhammer I had been using up to that point, I just didn't care, and probably nerfed my character significantly from a min-max perspective to switch over to it. And what's funny is I've never really gone back to it since then, just because there are other weapons that I like more that are kind of similar to the Chikage. But my first playthrough of Elden Ring was played almost entirely with katanas, which kind of used a lot of the skills that I developed with the Chikage, and that kind of benefited me in the long run since I was kind of put them to good use in Elden Ring. And I'm sure if I went back to it now post Elden Ring, I would be a force to be reckoned with the Chikage. Number five on my list this is kind of a hot take, but it is the threaded cane. I know it's kind of generally considered the weakest of the three starting weapons of the game, but I did pick it during my first playthrough because it was the closest option to a katana. So, um, that was the one that I used. But I did quickly replace it with the Kirk hammer. But before that, I did enjoy sort of experimenting with the whip version. And frankly, it probably did get me killed more often than not in the early days since I didn't really understand how to use it effectively and kind of account for the wind up of the swing. But ever since then, it's kind of remained my go-to starting weapon for most builds with the saw spear as a backup, because you can kind of use the range of the whip combined with the saw spear as a more traditional weapon. But the playthrough that really enhanced my love for it was my most recent one with my wife. She wanted me to use the cane because she liked the lore of it, which was essentially that the stylish hunters of the workshop kind of believed themselves to be better than their more blood crazed brethren, and so they used the cane instead of stuff like the saw spear, and they wore their classy top hats. So they kind of had like this je ne sais quoi about themselves. So she got a kick out of that, and honestly, I did too. I thought that was kind of cool. So she insisted it to be our go-to weapon for the majority of the game until she discovered the majesty of the Holy Moonlight Sword, and we did make that trade later on. So the cane doesn't pack much of a punch, but the whip version is a lot of fun, and it does kind of recall Castlevania, which I've never played, but respect and really like it artistically. And the fact that it's the whip is serrated makes it pack more of a punch than you'd think. You should have seen how quickly I melted Amelia's health bar with a transformed cane that was buffed with fire paper. I couldn't believe how fast she went down. So number four on this list is Simon's Bowblade. I really love Simon's Bowblade so much, particularly as a backup ranged weapon. It to such a degree where I often kill him as soon as I see him in the DLC just to get it earlier than whenever he dies himself. If you've expected a blood tinge, which I typically do in order to use the Evelyn effectively, it can be incredibly useful. My first Orphan of Koskill was at the hands of this bow. Even though he struck me as I fired and we both died, it still counted, baby. It's also really great for picking off those annoying enemies at a distance, especially if you mix it with that rune that you can put on that restores bullets with visceral attacks that provide a consistent supply. The blade itself is fine enough, and it's no doubt cool as hell that the blade can transform into a bow. But even if you don't want to use it as your main, I can't recommend the bow blade as a backup enough. Number three here is the Holy Moonlight Sword. So the only From Software titles I've ever played for more than a couple of hours are Bloodborne and Elden Ring. So my love for the Holy Moonlight Sword is definitely based on Bloodborne and Bloodborne alone. But even with that being said, just that cutscene of Ludwig bringing it out during that boss fight, it still hit home for me. The blue green color scheme is just absolutely stunning. It's essentially my favorite color when you get that color it's glowing like that. And other examples of it would be like obviously the Final Fantasy VII materia and the life stream. The colors that are used for like all the shrines and Tears of the Kingdom use that color scheme. Also, those colors are routinely projected onto Spaceship Earth at Epcot, which my wife and I noticed on our honeymoon over the last year. But I've used this weapon twice. Once in a playthrough alongside Tree Trunk Sean, that was a co-op playthrough, and then again most recently when I transitioned from the threaded cane to the Holy Moonlight Sword at the behest of my wife. And as much as I love the cane, there is no question that we got a major damage increase when we transitioned to the sword, even though I hadn't fully spec'd into strength and arcane. Its ability to sling projectiles is just incredibly useful. Its regular moveset, when glowing, just packs such a punch that you often don't even need to rely on the projectiles. Beautiful and powerful, the Holy Moonlight Sword, it delivers, baby. So number two on this list are the Blades of Mercy. So since the Threaded Cane, we've basically already been in weapons that I would consider to be among my favorite of all time in any video game. But the Blades of Mercy might just be up at number two, both in Bloodborne and in gaming as a whole. I love it that much. The curvature of the blades, just combined with the sound design and the visual design of like the moon glinting off them as they're swung, they're just like irresistible weapons to me. And as a dual wield, the moveset you get with the blades are second to only one. Only one other weapon I can think of that has a deeper moveset. And you probably guessed that weapon is coming up next. It doesn't hurt that the Blades of Mercy are wielded by Eileen the Crow, which is definitely one of the coolest characters in the game. I mean, watching her go to town on Henrik during her little side quest is certainly one of the coolest moments of the early game. But I confess there have been many times that I've killed her in Central Yarnum just so I can use them myself. So sorry about that, Eileen. And then number one on my weapons list is, of course, the Rakuyo. There could be no other. The Rakuyo essentially mixes what I like in so many of my other favorite weapons in the game, particularly the Chikage and the Blades of Mercy, into one just awesome weapon. The moveset is second to none. It makes the combo potential absolutely crazy. Other than the giant spikes of fiery blood, you can pretty much use all of the moves that Lady Maria uses against you in her boss battle. And if you're listening to this, you probably know that is a lot of moves. Wielding this weapon is almost a form of expression. You could probably get by just spamming R1, but you'll look a lot cooler if you're swinging these babies around in like a whirling dervish of unpredictable slashes and stabs. I think the devs knew this was the coolest weapon too because they sure as hell make you work for it and they force you to defeat two of those giant whale bastards in the fishing hamlet with nowhere to hide in that well. But pro tip, during my last playthrough, I realized for the first time that they are parryable, which makes that fight a lot more doable solo. The only thing that can make the Rakuyo better is if it actually made that incredibly intimidating clang it makes when Lady Maria separates the blades in her cutscene instead of the dainty little pop it makes when you do it. But even so, the Rakuyo is my favorite weapon in Bloodborne, and frankly, my favorite weapon in all of video games. So those are my top 10 weapons. Let's move on to my ranking of the levels in Bloodborne. There's part of my inspiration here is there's a video on YouTube from this channel called Demodcracy where his audience ranked them. I don't really agree with the number that they used, and they kind of made some weird splits for some areas, like Murgo's Loft Middle. Um, and the Nightmare of Mensis are like separate entries. They also include areas that I don't really consider to be full levels, like the Hunter's Dream, and then even like the Hunter's Workshop Falling Puzzle in the Cathedral Ward was weirdly separated out as its own level. So I've eliminated all that and just put together a list of 15 that I believe best encapsulate the full game. These are ranked primarily based on their layout, visual design, enemy design, and variety. And ultimately, I like even the lowest entries. So even like the first couple that I will be talking about, they are the lowest here, but I still have some respect for them. So with that, let's get into it with number 15, which is the lecture building. So there's not a whole lot going on in the lecture building. It's mostly used as kind of a gateway to the Nightmare Front. Well, not just the Nightmare Frontier, but the Nightmare areas of the main game. The enemy design is also just like completely limited to those student squid things, which they're not exactly the most dynamic foes in Bloodborne, quite frankly. But that said, I think the visual design of the area is fantastic, and in my last playthrough, I also really appreciated all the little lore notes that you can find throughout. And it makes it a pretty eye-opening area if you're following along with the lore in real time as you play through the game. And it's also the home of patches, so that's always fun, right? Number 14 is the Nightmare Frontier. So I respect the Nightmare Frontier, but it is easily the most difficult and painful area to traverse through in the main game. Obviously, it's got the giant poison swamps, it's got the boulder throwing giants. Those are compounded by the fact that you're constantly getting invaded until you can kill the Bell Maiden for the first time, which, by the way, is easily doable early on if you're using either the Evelyn or the Simon Bowblade. You can kill her from a distance, and that's really convenient to do. So although you can access this area mid-game, I do typically leave it for near the end of the game when I'm like so powerful that nothing in there really stands much of a chance against me. Visually, I also find the area lacking. Everywhere looks very similar, and it actually makes the Nightmare Frontier like the one place where I still find myself kind of getting consistently lost. You could maybe say throw the Forbidden Woods in there as well on occasion, but I think I've largely gotten that area pretty much down at this point, although it is really large and so it's easy to get lost in there too. I will say though that it is cool that you can kind of look up and see Murgo's loft at one point, and then even cooler, if you look down into the fog, you can see the ship masts of the fishing hamlet, which kind of indicates that all of the various nightmare realms are in fact connected. And while it isn't the toughest fight in the world, I've always appreciated the Amygdala boss at the end. After seeing them all over the place in Yharnam, having one just kind of plop down in front of me during that first playthrough was really shocking and awesome. And I really got a kick out of that. So number 13, I'm going to go with the research hall. I was actually surprised to see this level ranked as high as it was in that democracy video I mentioned. It actually is ranked all the way up at number 2. Um, but at the same time, I can appreciate it from a level design perspective. It is the closest the game ever comes to sort of creating a Zelda style dungeon, because the hall is like 5 or 6 stories high, and it requires you to find your way to the top and then change the level's layout by raising all of the winding staircases. Yeah, so that's really cool. But while I really enjoy and appreciate the level, its fatal flaw for me is just sort of the sameness of the visual design, and it doesn't have much in terms of enemy variety either. It's mostly made up of those same kind of research patients, which there are a couple different versions of them, but they look the same, and it gets a little old fighting them. I would say, yeah, especially since it's not exactly a short level, unless you just really run through it really fast. But unlike the Nightmare Frontier, I never really feel like the level outstays its welcome. And I always ultimately enjoy my trek to the Living Failures and Lady Maria. So number 12, I actually have Old Yarnum. I almost want to put Old Yarnum below the Research Hall because realistically, I do enjoy the Research Hall more. And as limited as its enemy variety is, it's still more varied than it's like literally the two beast enemies that you face for almost the entirety of the Old Yarnum level. The big gimmick here is the old hunter Jura firing down on your ass from on high for the first time. But I've played it so much that it's not really even much of a hazard for me anymore. Like I know where he's going to be able to hit me, and I know where to take cover and to stick and move and run. But while the enemy variety is suspect, the level design itself is really great, and the lore of the place is also really cool. It's ground zero for the outbreak of the Ashen Blood and essentially the Beastly Scourge, and that led the church and its hunters to ultimately just kind of take the nuclear option and burn the entire place to the ground. And then the fact that Jura stays behind to defend the surviving beasts out of pity is also a cool character touch for him. I also like the visual design, particularly once you finally make it down into the city streets. And I was really blown away the first time I defeated Dark Beast Parl and discovered the back door into the area. So while Old Yarnum is not my favorite place to explore, my respect for it sort of counters this, and that's why it lands at number 12. Moving on to number 11, I have Hemwick Charnel Lane. This is another one that was kind of tough for me to rank as there really isn't a lot going on here for your run through the area. But it does kind of stand out to me as the first time Bloodborne really shakes up the environment from sort of the haunted 1800s Victoria setting it leans on. So I respect it for that, and then also the fact that you can see Castle Canehurst across the lake in the distance here. That is a really cool moment. I think it is kind of the lakeside visual element here that puts it as high as it does, combined with the fact that I'm always looking forward to getting to the Charnel Lane and getting some easy levels in before knocking off Dark Beast Pearl and Vicar Amelia. So number 10 is the Upper Cathedral Ward. This one was tough because there are some elements I really like about the Upper Cathedral Ward, and then there's some others that I think kind of put it in the bottom third of the game's levels. On one hand, it is without question one of the most atmospheric and arguably the creepiest level in the game. Numerous jump scares and some truly terrifying enemies between the aggressive werewolves to fight in the dark and then the just infuriating brain suckers that run the place. The fact that it is one of the few levels that actually plays music while you're going through it is also really cool, and it makes the discovery of the make contact gesture feel that much more mysterious. But the enemy variety is just piss poor here, and even worse, the halls are filled with those brain suckers, which I would argue are the enemies that are the least fun to fight in the entire game. So while it's visually and atmospherically arresting, it leaves something to be desired in terms of gameplay, which kind of results in Upper Cathedral Ward. It's the epitome of a mixed bag, and so that's why I put it here at number 10. So number 9, I'm going with Forbidden Woods. During my first couple of years with Bloodborne, I definitely would have ranked the Forbidden Woods considerably lower than this, maybe even at the bottom. It's the first area that really feels like a chore to get through because it includes just a massive number of environmental hazards and enemies, and it is so big and easy to get lost in. But there's no doubt about it, this is definitely the game's biggest difficulty spike. But at the same time, I don't think any area is more satisfying to conquer, and you're gonna get some good leveling in when you set out to traverse through these woods. I also like all the little secrets the devs mix in here, including the secret abhorrent beast that tries to trick you into sending him to the cathedral ward so he can dine on more people. There's the foreshadowing of the celestial emissaries lurking as you get closer to Bergenworth, and my personal favorite is the ability to sneak into the back of Yusufka's clinic and discover what's really been going on in there. So the Forbidden Woods can certainly feel unforgiving, but over the years, I think this has kind of only made me grow to appreciate it more. So number eight, I'm gonna go with Forsaken Castle Canehurst. Now I think some might be surprised because that I have the castle this low, as it appears to be fairly beloved. It actually came at number one on Democracy's community list. My first time through, I will say I was also enchanted by the just the beauty of the place, and to a degree I still am. There's no question the visual design of the castle is really kind of second to none in Bloodborne. But at the same time, I really think the enemy variety is lacking here. It mainly comes down to the kind of the ghostly women, the occasional blood-sucking gargoyle, and then there's like the other little servant guys, and that's really it. Of course, unless you can consider those ass-kicking bloodlickers outside, which I consider to be the toughest enemies in the game. But there's only a few of them, and once you get in the castle, you don't have to deal with them anymore. So while I have a lot of love for Canehurst, after all, this is where you get the Evelyn and the Chikage, both beloved weapons in my mind. Thanks to its visual design and its secrets as well, with Queen Annalise's chambers. So I love all those things, but ultimately it kind of feels like an improved Upper Cathedral Ward to me. It's outstanding in terms of atmosphere and visual design, but it is kind of lacking where it matters most. So that's why I've kind of got it in the middle of the pack here at number eight. So moving on to number seven, I'm putting these two together. It is Yahar'gul, Unseen Village, and the Hypogean Jail. So Democracy's list actually broke up these areas, but I think that's silly considering they are literally the exact same level, though you don't get to fully explore it until you return after defeating Wrong. So I'm putting them together. I will admit that Yargul is home to some of the most annoying enemies in the game, like those corpse chests in particular, which they really are all over the streets down there. But I also link it to some of the game's coolest moments. I'll never forget getting unexpectedly abducted by those bad guys and brought to the jail for the first time, and just feeling that sense of panic set in, waking up in the dark room, no clue where to go, before finding my way out of there and kind of setting out into those moonlit streets and exploring. That's a really great moment in the game. And then equally memorable is obviously the descent of the Blood Moon and the appearance of the Migdalas for the first time, unless you just have really high, what is that? Insight. Unless you just have really high insight. So that's kind of Bloodborne's biggest like oh shit moment, particularly the first time through the game. The level design here is also, I would argue, top notch. It's got all kinds of secrets and nooks and even teleport gates to explore. So while I'll admit you probably won't get through either version of Yarhargul without experiencing some frustration, I've got to give it up for the area's level design and its links to some of the coolest moments in the game. Number six, I have Bergenworth. This is another one that may be questionable given how small it is. I know that there are some who were kind of disappointed by Bergenworth's lack in scope after how much it was built up by the lore before you get there. But for me, I kind of find that even cooler. All of the shit that's been unleashed in Yarnum can be traced back to this very unassuming little two-story college in the middle of the woods. In my real life, I went to a small and old college myself, and it has plenty of buildings that look very similar to Bergenworth, so that might be part of it. It's also tough to top that scenic outlook over the lake with the giant moon shining down, just waiting for you to uncover its secrets. Really cool visual design. So I think that is a big part of the reason that it's as high as it is. At number five, I have the Fishing Hamlet. The Fishing Hamlet has been a bit of a grower for me. Like the Forbidden Ones in Yarhargul, it certainly has plenty of annoying elements. It's got Brador's invasions, it's got the lightning spamming fish, and of course those gigantic whales that want nothing more than to absolutely smash you into oblivion. But at the same time, stepping through the Astral Clock Tower to find this unassuming village and uncovering what really went on here is some of Bloodborne's best work. The village is absolutely filled with secrets. The devs were nice enough to give you two lamps to take the edge off the difficulty, which allows players to really explore to their heart's content without worrying too much about death. And of course, visually, the village is unlike anything else in Bloodborne, and it is the home of gaming's greatest piece of weaponry, so I gotta give it up for that too. At number four, I have the Nightmare of Mensis. I mean, the Nightmare of Mensis, it's just awesome. Yeah, it does have the annoying like brain thing zapping your health in the opening area, but what a payoff when you finally bring that thing down, especially when you go to, take a gander at it for yourself in that absolutely terrifyingly pitch black hellhole. Um, the giant spiders in the building are delightfully horrifying. As is exploring the many levels of Murgo's loft and kind of uncovering the secrets within there. Again, you kind of got to give it up to the multi-tiered level design here, which sets the stage for too many secrets and hidden areas to name. It even allows you to get your rematch in for the with the Shadows of Yharnam as they patrol the level near the nightmare-inducing infant. I might consider the Nightmare Princess to be the most fascinating area from a lore perspective, and just as a meticulously designed final exam, it excels spectacularly. So up at number three, I have the Cathedral Ward. Um, Other than maybe the Forbidden Woods, Cathedral Ward is the largest area in the base game, and I would say it's certainly the most important. Almost all the NPCs live there, and the ward kind of acts as a hub for the entire first third of the game, as it is the entry point for Old Yarnum, Hemwick Charnel Lane, and the Hypogean Jail, and later Upper Cathedral Ward. At this point, I would say we're in contenders for greatest levels of all time territory. There's just so much to Cathedral Ward that it's hard to name it all. You have the climb through Odin Chapel to Upper Cathedral Ward. You have the giant courtyard with the giants. You have the cramped residential area with like the fog and the enemies there. You have the area to the right of the Grand Cathedral with those two NPCs. You have the overlook out of the left side of the chapel where you can see the Forbidden Woods weighing in the distance. That's really cool. You have the hidden and abandoned old workshop. You have the descent to Old Yarnum. I mean, the list just goes on and on. It's filled with strong enemy variety and just impeccable level design. Cathedral Ward is an area you can explore for hours on end and just never get tired of it. So at number two, I have the Hunter's Nightmare. So take everything about the Cathedral Ward that's great, put it in a deranged nightmare with even more enemy variety and incredible visual design, and then you can wrap it in the lore that essentially serves as the hellscape that all hunters, and including assumedly you, are destined to spend eternity in, and you can start to get a grasp about what's great about the Hunter's Nightmare. The callbacks to the Cathedral Ward and Central Yarnum are incredible, but not as incredible as the wealth of weapons that the devs are just constantly throwing at you throughout this massive level. And hey, how about a random rematch with Old Yarnum's blood-starved beast, complete with another crazed hunter with a Gatling gun guarded her? Why not? How about filling the area with blood-crazed hunters that are interested in killing the beasts, infecting the place as much as they are with killing you? How about creating a literal river of blood running through the place, symbolizing the bloodlust of the hunters that have devoted every fiber of their being to killing? The Hunter's Nightmare has all this and more. And for anyone who hasn't tried Bloodborne's DLC yet, it is reason enough on its own to warrant a purchase. It is, to put quite simply, awesome, but not awesome enough to come in at number one, which, by process of elimination, you have deduced is Central Yarnum. As great as Cathedral Ward and the Hunter's Nightmare are, I just can't bring myself to put them above the game's starting area. This is where we all cut our teeth with the game, and as such, it's safe to say it's where we have our earliest memories of helplessness, determination, and ultimately triumph that this game is so great at bringing out of us. And just as an introductory level to the game, it's absolutely sublime. It's filled with multi-layered exploration, impressive enemy variety, two very different bosses that serve to teach players the different sides of success in Bloodborne, and all that's wrapped up in just that absolutely impeccable haunted Victorian setting and atmosphere that FromSoft pulled us so well. I might argue that Central Yarnum is the greatest first level to any game ever, and when you come out on top of all the other incredible levels that Bloodborne has to offer, doesn't that make you one of the greatest pieces of game design ever made? I think so. So with that, let's move on to the grand finale, which is my ranking of the bosses in the game. As I mentioned earlier, I'm only ranking the bosses found in the main game and the DLC, since I've only faced each of the Chalice Dungeon bosses once, and it has been years since I faced them, so I don't feel comfortable ranking them here. I will also note that I got the Yarnum Sunrise ending in my most recent playthrough, since I was letting my wife make all the choices. So my take on Garamond and the Moon Presence are significantly less fresh, and I actually decided to omit them from my difficulty ranking since it's been years since I faced them. But I did rank them in my overall quality ranking, which I'm doing first. So with that, let's kick things off with number 22, which is the Blood-Starved Beast. So I'll never forget my first time defeating the Blood-Starved Beast, which I did very satisfyingly solo, after calling in help for Father Gascoigne and not even being alive for that victory, because I actually died in that battle with Gascoigne, like right as my teammate made the killing blow. So while I got to move past him, it didn't really feel like I beat him. I earned that victory. So unlike that one, this victory really did feel earned, and it was the first time I had faced a boss that really gave me trouble since I beat the cleric beast on my first try. That I was able to overcome on my own merits. Um, but on subsequent playthroughs, I have to say I find the Bloodstarved Beast to be pretty underwhelming. She just really uses the same three or four moves over and over again, and while the poison damage does, definitely ratchets up the intensity, it's not really enough to prevent the fight from being on the dull end for me, especially compared with just the other many phenomenal boss fights that lie in wait throughout the rest of the game. Um, Even so, Bloodstar Beast, it's a well-designed early challenge for new players to the game, and I'm sure many of us have satisfying memories of bringing her down for the first time. Number 21 is probably going to be a little bit more controversial than that because at 21, I actually have a Britas, Daughter of the Cosmos. While I love the lore implication of a Britas as the left behind Great One and the source of the church's obsession with them, to be honest, I just don't think it's a particularly well-designed fight. It's well known as one of the hardest in the game, maybe the hardest in the base game. And while I would agree with that, unlike most of the game's challenging fights, I just don't find her particularly satisfying to overcome. While I wanted to fight her by learning her moveset and punishing her based on that, I found the best strategy to fight the camera and stick like hell to her backside, swinging wildly. And I understand that's how many Dark Souls bosses are fought, but for Britas, I just wanted a little bit more. So up at number 20, I have the Celestial Emissary. You probably won't find too many putting what is essentially the appetizer for the Abritas fight above the main course, but I've always had a soft spot for multi-enemy fights, and I just like the payoff of fighting in that garden just filled with these little buggers after seeing them alluded to throughout the game, particularly in Yusufka's clinic. I also really like the boss arena in the Luluman Flower Garden. They are Lady Maria's favorites after all. There's not really much to it other than that, but I've never had a bad time going up against the Celestial Emissary, so that's a feather in its bulbous cap. So number 19, I have the Cleric Beast. I don't think I've ever actually lost to the Cleric Beast, but I think he is almost perfectly balanced difficulty wise for when you face him so early on in the game, because I do typically find myself running low on flasks by the time I bring him down. I also appreciate that you can learn his moveset and react accordingly, and that the game kind of subtly rewards you for this for being aggressive, because you can cripple his limbs and sort of allow for even further punishment while he's kind of working on that. His entrance, just from out of nowhere at the end of the Great Bridge in Central Yarnum, is also great, as is his kind of flowy visual design. And the Cleric Beast just kind of sets the stage for everything to come and is the source of almost every player's first great victory. So, come on, put some respect on his name. Up at number 18, I have the Witch of Hemwick. I know the witch is kind of viewed as a joke, and to be fair, she really kind of is. But at the same time, this is the closest thing to like a puzzle fight in Bloodborne, and when you don't know what you're doing, it really is a fun one to put together. Uniqueness counts for something, and I have to give it up to the witch for that. At number 17, I have the Moon Presence. So, as I noted earlier, I am having to go off my memory for this one, as it has probably been 4 years or more since I last battled the Moon Presence. It's one of my favorites in terms of lore implications and visual design. I mean, that shot of the Moon Presence depending in front of the Blood Moon is one of Bloodborne's finest and certainly most of its iconic shots. But I've never really had much of a struggle against it, except for amusingly, my first time when it does it's like Sin Harvest move, leaving you at 1 HP. It killed me instantly because I had my Chikage blooded, so that was super fun. Though that in mind, I don't really have any great moments of overcoming adversity here. The fight takes place in an absolutely stunning battlefield, but I think most of us give the Gehrman fight most of the points associated with that. So, after you do a fight that's exhilarating as that one, it is kind of tough for the Moon Presence to not feel like something of a letdown by comparison. So at number 16, I have Murgo's Wet Nurse. Some bosses age like a fine wine, and I find myself appreciating them more and more more familiar I get with them. But sadly, Murgo's Wet Nurse has not had that trajectory. This is another boss I don't think I've ever lost to. And while I thought she was absolutely awesome the first time I faced her, and I felt incredibly satisfied by beating her in one go, since then, I've come to realize that that really isn't as impressive as it seemed at the time. I don't care for her little purple haze move, which kind of goes on forever. And while it does ratchet up the intensity, it mostly just kind of results in the fight dragging on longer than it really needs to. I still think the Wet Nurse is fantastic visually, particularly with all those just intimidating blades like slashing around everywhere. But Bloodborne has plenty of superior bosses up its sleeve. But number 15, I have Vicar Amelia. This is one of those bosses that I think I like more than she really deserves. At the end of the day, she really is just another giant beast fight. But unlike the cleric beast, she can be a real challenge, especially for early players, many of whom likely come face to face with her before they really need to, because the game does give you Old Yarnum, Hemwick, and the Hypogean Jail to conquer first. But you only know that if you know where to look. So she has a pretty large health pool, and she also has the ability to regenerate her health, which can lead to some real frustration and even hopelessness early on if you don't know how to counter that. But on the other hand, if you come into the fight after leveling up through all those aforementioned areas, you got a fire buffed weapon, and particularly if you have a serrated fire buffed weapon, and then of course numbing mist at the ready to counter her healing. There's really not much to her, but she's still a lot of fun to take down, and certainly a satisfying boss to conquer if she's been giving you trouble. At number 14, I have Dark Beast Parl. I'm kind of surprised I have Parl as low as I do. There was a time when I would have put him much higher, just kind of based on his visual design alone. He's also maybe the easiest, well, I guess it'd be a stretch to say he's the easiest boss to miss. But the first time I played the game, when I explored the Hypogean Jail, I didn't know that he was hidden back there until my second time through the area. When after beating Rom. So by then he was a surprise, but also a cakewalk and no match for my upgraded Kirkhammer. But if you fight him early on, especially with a weapon that doesn't pack as much of a punch like the threaded cane, he can be a real challenge. Managing the camera against him is pretty frustrating, and I think he that knocks him down a peg or two. But overall, there's no question he's one cool boss, even if he's not the most unique or original. At number 13, I have Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. Mikolash can easily be one of the most frustrating bosses in the game. If you spend minutes chasing him down, only to be blasted in one shot by that Call Beyond attack. It's extremely powerful and hard to dodge, which is typically why I don't face him until after going through the DLC and equipping Lock's Shield, and then also decking myself out in Arcane Resistant Armor. If you can do both of those things, it does eliminate most of the challenge and allows you to appreciate how visually and orally intriguing this fight is. Whether you love it or you hate it, nobody that plays Bloodborne is going to forget their fight with Mikolash, and I think that does count for something. At number 12, I have Amygdala. This is another boss that has fallen for me somewhat over the years, but man, I did think it was cool the first time through. Knocking Amygdala and her bulbous pocked head is the best way to put some damage on her. But that is hard to do since it's so high in the air. But when you can pull it off, it sure is satisfying. I don't think I've ever lost to the base game Amygdala, but that one in the Chalice Dungeon where you had to fight her with the half health is a true nightmare, and one of the hardest things I've ever faced in a game. At number 11, I have Lawrence the First Vicar. As a fire infused reskin of the Cleric Beast, it is easy to dismiss Lawrence as kind of lazy design. The difference being that while I've never lost the Cleric Beast, I've only beaten Lawrence solo twice, and I find him to be brutally difficult. This is a boss that absolutely forces you to learn his moveset and learn how to dodge accordingly, because otherwise you are certainly going to have your face pounded into the ground time and time again. And that second phase is absolutely awesome. It forces you to learn a completely different moveset while finding the few places you can stand without taking damage. And then to top it all off, the Lawrence fight has what I consider to be the best piece of music in the entire game. And that is even including Gehrman's first Hunter track. I mean, when you mix opera, orchestra, and organ together, that is a recipe for success. Just ask Nobuo Uematsu and Kefka Palazzo if you don't believe me. Number 10 is the Orphan of Kos. The Orphan is widely considered the most difficult boss in Bloodborne and actually one of the most difficult fights of all time in any game. And I've got to agree, he's certainly up there. While I have his first phase down and can often get through without even taking a single hit, I've got to admit, I still find my palms sweating when he descends into phase 2 and goes absolutely ballistic, flying all over the lakeside battlefield. And it with that with that being said, that's also one of the most beautiful kind of combat arenas in the game. There's really not much I can say against the Orphan of Kos in terms of its fight design, and there's I don't really have any problems with it. There's just nine other bosses in this game I like even more. I mean, what can I say? Bloodborne is a masterpiece. So going up to number 9, I actually have the Living Failures. I know a lot of people kind of look past this boss as something of a joke, but while I can take it down pretty easily now, I did struggle with it a fair bit on my first playthrough. Everything that these guys do just packs a punch, and it can be hard to keep tabs on all their positions at once. But even though they rarely give me trouble now, I always enjoy going up against them. It's another one of my favorite boss arenas outside of Lady Maria's Astral Clock Tower. I love the challenge of multi-enemy boss fights. I think their Sephiroth-esque meteor attack is cool as hell. And after playing Majora's Mask for the first time recently, I've got to believe FromSoft kind of had those red giants from that game in mind when coming up with these guys, right? Up at number eight, I have Father Gascoigne. I hate to say it, but I've beaten Gascoigne so many times now that there are times where he doesn't even get my heart rate up anymore. But for first time players, he is absolutely tough. He seems insurmountable at times. He's aggressive, he hits hard, and that third phase is truly the stuff of nightmares for new players. The Hunter versus Hunter fights are my favorite style of boss battles in Bloodborne, and Father Gascoigne's added lore implications and just heart-wrenching tragic backstory make him one of the game's best. At number seven, I have Rom, the vacuous spider. You've obviously got to give Rom extra credit for the fight's backdrop. I don't think many would argue it is absolutely one of the best, if not the best, in the game. But the fight itself mixes in many of the elements I really love in a good Bloodborne boss. It's got multiple enemies to keep track of. It's got strong but predictable moves from the boss itself. And it's got meteors. Beyond that, you know that once you can take Rom down, you've entered the end game, and nothing in Yarnum will ever be the same. Up at number six, I have The One Reborn. This might be my hottest take, but I absolutely love The One Reborn. I love the fact that he bafflingly comes out of the moon, even though it's really never explained why or how. I love his boss arena with the two sides. They're reminiscent of the Demon Souls Tower Knight, but to me, they really remind me of Colossus number 15 from Shadow of the Colossus. It has a kind of a similar structure to that arena where you have to go up the side. And I love having to go up there and kill the witches that are up there to avoid taking their magic shots during the fight. I love the fact that the one reborn can absolutely stack himself up and blast you while you do that. Once you start wailing on him after you get through all that setup, I will admit that there's not much to the one reborn, but you do have to be careful about getting overly greedy and taking some falling bodies to the head. But when I factor in all those other sort of ancillary elements, I still can't help but look forward to my fights with this disgusting monstrosity every time. Number five, I have Martyr Logarius. God, this guy is cool. His intro cutscene where he cracks himself out of his icy shell is equal parts intimidating and satisfying. I mean, imagine how good that must feel. And then that shot of him just slowly walking towards you with his unkempt mane blowing in the icy wind, it's just awesome. His moveset is a lot of fun to master too. He's one of the rare magic casters in the game. So getting up close to him can be a challenge, and so can staying up on him since he can then fly around and sort of strike from above. But managing all of that while going toe to toe with this guy on top of Castle Canehurst, it just never gets old. At number four, I have the Shadows of Yharnam, and I just love everything about these guys. I love their visual design. I love how they walk out of the mist at the start of the battle and just start tearing you to shreds. I love how each one of them has a unique moveset to keep in mind as you battle them. I love trying to manage each of their individual health bars to put myself at the lowest risk of getting my face eaten off by a giant serpent in the final phase. I love the rush. I love the satisfaction of taking these guys down one by one with nothing but my trusty weapon of choice by my side. It is easily one of the most exhilarating fights of the game. At number three, I have Gurman the First Hunter. Once again, from here on out, we're in like contender for one of the best battles of all time territory. Gurman has it all. It's a fast-paced hunter versus hunter fight in an absolutely stunning location. But unlike the others, this confrontation has been built up from the beginning of the game. Depending on how much you've been paying attention, this fight is either the result of a shocking betrayal or a dance of death between two selfless hunters determined to save the other from an eternity of torment. This fight is absolutely incredible, either way. At number two, I have Ludwig the Accursed slashed Holy Blade. I mean, what a beast. Even though I know every single one of this boss's moves across both phases by heart, it still takes me multiple times each run to try to bring him down. Part of that is because I'm always so eager to go into the DLC to get either the Rakuyo or Simon's Bowl Blade or the Holy Moonlight Sword, which are three of the greatest weapons of all time. So I do tend to come in here probably earlier than I should. But the other part is because Ludwig hits like a truck and he has major combo potential besides. I don't think there's any question that the mid-fight cutscene here is the best in all of Bloodborne, and the dichotomy of the two halves of the fight are second to none. Every time I face Ludwig, my appreciation for him grows. And I even considered him putting him at the top this time, but as good as he is, I just couldn't bring myself to put him over my number one pick, which would be obvious to everyone by now. It is Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Not only is Lady Maria my favorite Bloodborne boss, she is certainly in my top five bosses ever. Probably number two. I think Elden Ring's Radahn kind of edges her out at the top of the list. But while Radahn is a spectacle, Lady Maria I think is just mechanically perfect. All of her moves are learnable and replicable, as noted earlier in my discussion of the Rikuyo, and satisfying to work through. The fight's pace is blistering and exhilarating. It's backed by another phenomenal piece of music that enhances the kind of ballad of death between the two of you. And the lore of Maria herself is probably my favorite of any characters in the game, other than maybe Gehrman's, which is only his and Maria's are kind of intertwined, so it can kind of just enhances my love for Maria's backstory. And as good as phase one is, phases two and three just take it up into the stratosphere as Maria adds range, and despite her disdain for the art of blood fighting, succumbs to it in order to prevent you from uncovering what the hunters did in the fishing hamlet, or perhaps to prevent you from doing anything worse. I remember a few playthroughs ago, Maria killed me more than 10 times in a row, and then every time she did, I was excited because that just meant I got to fight her one more time before the next playthrough. So that's my ranking of all the mainline bosses in Bloodborne. But to close this out, I want to rank them again, this time in terms of their difficulty. This is based off my most recent run, and it factors in the number of times I died to each. So as such, Gehrman and the Moon Presence are omitted because, as I noted, I did not fight them in this run. But in case you're curious, I'd probably put the Moon Presence toward the upper half of the bottom, and Gehrman is in the lower half of the top, if you can follow that. Keep in mind, this is from the perspective of someone who is an expert at the game, and these are all one-on-one fights without other players or NPC summons. Newcomers will probably find all these fights hard, so don't be offended if I rank the boss that's been tearing you in half for the last couple of hours toward the bottom. In most of these cases, I was there once too. So starting off at the bottom with number 20 is kind of surprising is Vicar Amelia, who I died to 0 times in my most recent playthrough. There was a time when I could not fathom putting Vicar Amelia this low on the list, but at the same time, I couldn't fathom how easy I found her to be in my most recent playthrough. As far as I know, unless maybe the Witch of Hemwick didn't touch me, Amelia is the only boss that didn't damage me even once during my most recent run or ever through Bloodborne. My weapon of choice? A transformed threaded cane buffed with fire paper. I didn't even need to use my numbing mist. The fight was over within a minute. She never even knew it hit her. So think about that the next time you call the threaded cane puny. Number 19 is the Celestial Emissary, who I died to 0 times. Let's be real. The only reason the Celestial Emissary even has a chance against you is because of all his little minions ganging up on you during the fight. But even then, his health pool is so low, he usually goes down faster than any other boss in the game, unless, you bring a fiery threaded cane into battle with Amelia. Number 18, I have the Witch of Hemwick, who I died to 0 times. Most people rank the witch at the bottom of their list, but if you get caught by her, there's a good chance you're going down. A chance that increases to 100% if you get caught in an attack cycle from one of the scythe wielding summons while you're caught in the lengthy animation of her kind of ripping your eye out there. And since there are two of these witches, each with their own regenerating health pool, this fight has the potential to drag on, which increases the likelihood of you making a mistake. Even so, it's easy to completely avoid the summons, which are the biggest threat of the fight, and if you can do that, the witch really doesn't stand much of a chance. At number 17, I ranked the Cleric Beast, who I died to 0 times. The Cleric Beast is one of the few bosses I've never lost to. Even so, I never find him to be a cakewalk either, especially on a character that hasn't leveled up yet, which is pretty much all of them at this point. It's not hard to learn his moveset, but it is hard to prevent yourself from getting greedy. And with a weapon that has almost certainly not been upgraded even once when you fight him, you're going to be here for a while, requiring you to successfully complete a prolonged battle against a large enemy that can kill you in 2 to 4 hits in a tight area. No small feat for new players. At number 16, I have Murgo's Wet Nurse, who I died to 0 times. Another of the bosses I've never lost to. The big threat here is getting caught when she duplicates herself and enshrouds the arena in purple mist, which prevents you from seeing what the hell's going on around you. Luckily, this has an easy counter, which is running around in circles until the mist dissipates. Now, it can be a pain when she uses this move multiple times in one fight, but typically she's only prolonging the inevitable, especially since by this point you're a battle-hardened vet that had to overcome forces much greater than the nurse on your way to this fight. Number 15, I have Father Gascoigne, who I died to 0 times. This may seem like a slap in the face for all those who struggled against Papa G, but for the experienced players, he's honestly something of a pushover. It's easy to create distance between yourself and him with the use of all the tombstones lining the field, and while his third phase is aggressive, comboing the music box with Molotovs will often bring him down before he even starts swinging. Number 14, I have Amygdala, who I died to 0 times. Obviously, this is for the main game version of Amygdala because it turns out she's a lot harder when she's skilled for in game and you have to fight her with half health in the Chalice dungeons. But with your full health bar and an upgraded weapon equipped, she shouldn't give you too much trouble. It can be hard to track all her limbs and avoid getting hit at times, and you also often have to get caught right up under her to bait her attacks to hit something other than her ironclad tail, which shrugs off virtually anything you can throw at it. But if you can stay cool and heal when you need to, and swing for the fences when her at her head when you can bring down Amygdala without too much of a hassle. At number 13, I have the Living Failures, who I died to 0 times. The key to beating the failures is to keep tabs on all of their positions and prevent them from ganging up on you. One's almost certainly going to be shooting some kind of spell your way, but that's pretty easily avoidable by putting the central tree in the arena between you. It's also blockable with the help of Lock Shield, which you should have picked up in the preceding area leading up to the fight. And once you realize that the meteor attack always comes from the same direction, and that you can just hide behind the handy tree to avoid all damage, this battle just becomes a battle of attrition between you and your patience. At number 12, I have the Bloodstarred Beast, who I died to 0 times. This flappy beast would be much lower on the list if it wasn't for the poison buildup in phases 2 and 3. If you get caught in a combo, or God forbid, in that grab animation, it can be hard, if not impossible, to heal yourself and pop an antidote in time to avoid death, or at the very least, another swipe to your head. Luckily, this beast is easily countered through the use of parries or the old tried and true method of dodging to the left. Number 11, I have Marta Ligarius, who I died to 0 times. This is another boss that used to give me tons of problems, but that I ultimately have learned so well that he rarely kills me once, and as was the case for this playthrough. If you can get through his magic damage at the outset and just get right up on him, he will start swinging for the fences, which is your cue to parry and riposte him. You can do this over and over and trivialize the first phase of the fight. Well, then all you have to do is learn the timing of his kind of diving attack, and remember to shoot his spear when he drives it into the ground to summon raining death. At number 10, I have the One Reborn, who I died to 0 times. Some might be surprised to see the One Reborn this high on the list, but if you get caught by him without an ample health pool, he definitely has one-shot potential. You also have to remember to take out the witches shooting spells at you from the rafters, because otherwise this fight is much harder. It's easy to get overly greedy and take more hits than you need to, whether from the boss himself, the raining bodies he drops on your head, or the poison liquid he sheds on the ground. But if you can keep that in check and keep an eye on your health bar, you can bring him down without too much trouble. At number 9, I have Mikulesh, Host of the Nightmare, who I died to 0 times. This guy is here for one reason and one reason only: the Call Beyond. Nothing is more defeating than chasing Mikulesh's ass all over the place for minutes, only to drop in on him and get one-shotted by this arena-covering blast. And he likes to spam that thing too, so the only real counter is to stack as many arcane-resistant armor pieces as you can and be aggressive in phase 2 to try to prevent him from casting the spell. If you've gone through at least the research hall and the DLC by this point, you can also utilize the lock shield, which helps immensely. At number 8, we have Ron the Vacuous Spider, who I died to 1 time. This fight is a challenge for many, as it requires you to keep tabs on all of the many spider enemies and that come to Rom's aid once you start wailing on her. You also have to avoid her meteor attack that will absolutely kill you if you got caught in it. And it was this meteor attack that killed me on my most recent run. The counter is to start running in a circle around Rom when she rears up to signify the attack, and always keep her in view while you cull the spider minion so you don't get caught unawares. I know some of the more aggressive among us try to skip killing the spiders, but I don't recommend it unless you get Rom down to low health, only to get brained from a jumping spider from off screen. At number 7, I had the Shadows of Yharnam, who I died to 1 time. The Shadows can certainly be daunting without backup because they lock you into a 3-on-1 handicap match, and even worse, they summon those giant snakes that are nigh on unavoidable and will likely one-shot you in phase 3. My strategy is to try to whittle all of their health bars down fairly evenly so that whoever is left standing at the end doesn't have time to summon their serpentine friends before they're taking a dirt nap. But this is easier said than done, especially thanks to that katana wielding R1 spammer that likes to get in your face throughout the battle. I will admit there can be some RNG at play here, but if you can skillfully use the terrain to your advantage and keep all those guys in your sights, you got a good shot at success. At number six, I have Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, who I died to one time. While all of Lady Maria's moves are learnable, she is something of a combo master, so you really have to know when and where to dodge to avoid her attacks, especially in phases two and three. She's parryable, which can help if you can get the timing down, but I've often found myself overly relying on that mechanic and having more success when I just take her on one with dodging and punishing. But whatever works for you, enjoy it. This is one of the greatest boss battles of all time. At number five, I have Dark Beast Parl, who I died to two times. It might come as something of a surprise to see the Dark Beast this far up, but considering you can fight him as early as boss 4 or as late as boss 9, his difficulty is really dependent on when you go up against him. In this playthrough, I battled him after beating the Witch of Henwick, but before Amelia, which could explain why I found her so easy and found Parl such a challenge. Battling the camera is a challenge against this guy, and his range and combo potential is no joke. He also moves fairly quickly, so it can be hard to really put some damage on him until you can knock him down, at which point you can wail on him for seconds at a time. Parlo requires you to stick and move, battle the camera, and soak up some big hits to find your time to heal without being comboed. Makes for a pretty challenging fight if you take him on early in the game. So I have a big kind of difficulty leap here up to number four, which is a Britos, daughter of the Cosmos, who killed me five times. This is really one of the toughest fights. I mean, Britos, she really packs a punch and comes armed with some of the hardest moves to dodge in the game, including a version of a Call Beyond, which is rough. She has an absolutely devastating charge. And then she has those tentacle whips that will almost always hit you more than once per swing. As noted earlier, trying to fight her on her terms is a fool's errand. I found my success by locking off and just sticking to her side as best I could. It's janky, it isn't pretty, but it is the most effective strategy I've been able to come up with. At number three, I have the Orphan of Kos, who I died to five times. The first phase of the Orphan is honestly pretty easy if you can get the parry timings down, which isn't particularly hard to do. But the second phase can be absolutely brutal when the Orphan sprouts wings, flies all over the place, and sends down either blood or arcane, I'm not really sure which, flying all over the place alongside lightning strikes that are he calls in from his mother's corpse. He's still parryable in phase two, but it sure is harder to pull that off without taking a couple of big hits to the face in the process. Another option is to try to stick to his back and either farm backstabs or just get some swings in before he zips off somewhere else. But either way, the Orphan certainly isn't going down without a fight. Now, number two, I have Ludwig the Accursed slash Holy Blade, who I died to six times. This fight is really something. I know Ludwig's moveset even better than the Orphan of Kos, and it still took me more than one more try to take him down. Unlike the Orphan, Ludwig is not parryable outside of the two guaranteed windows you get during phase two. And you also have to learn two completely different move sets. The first phase in particular, you must have like 10 moves at least, including multiple versions of flying stomps that can absolutely one-shot you. The delayed one almost certainly will and is the harder to dodge, as well as a lunge that also has one-shot potential and a flurry of other moves that are challenging to get down. He even has a rear buck that attack that prevents you from posting up on his backside. The only real way to beat Ludwig is to learn all of his moves and the timing windows for each, and they are far more numerous for me to go into here without a visual aid, but what a fight it is, and there's perhaps no boss that's more satisfying to take down by yourself. And at number one, we have Lawrence, the first vicar, who I died to 11 times in this most playthrough. Even before this playthrough, I knew Lawrence was my kryptonite. He essentially requires you to play near flawlessly. All of his moves pack one hell of a mighty wallop that will kill you instantly if your health isn't topped off near the brim. Honestly, getting him past phase one is my biggest challenge. Once he's down on the ground for phase two, I find him significantly more manageable, even though he is still incredibly dangerous here. Patience is key in this fight, as is a character with at least 30 vigor, fire resistance armor equipped, and a level 10 weapon ready to dish out the maximum damage that you can during the brief windows you have the opportunity. But hey, at least you get that masterpiece of a song backing you up. So there we have it. I think I've said just about all I can about Bloodborne at this point. If you couldn't tell, I love this game dearly, and I think it is truly one of the most spectacular pieces of video game art that has ever been crafted. While I love Elden Ring like everybody else, I think what sets Bloodborne apart for me is just how handcrafted all of it feels. Unlike in Elden Ring, Bloodborne is pared down and focused, and as a result, everything you do and encounter in the game has heightened purpose, and I would argue quality. I think it has the best collection of bosses, weapons, and maybe even levels in any video game I've ever played. And even the video game's storytelling, while perhaps difficult to parse on a single playthrough, is fascinating and rich with compelling secrets and mysteries. And at least to me, there is no RPG that makes you feel as though your own skills are growing alongside your characters, where that pursuit of power transitions from your avatar to yourself. And I think it really has. In general, few games have challenged me to the same degree they did before and after playing and ultimately platinuming Bloodborne. And speaking of that platinum, as noted in my trophy focus episode, Bloodborne is currently the home of my favorite platinum trophy of the 38 I've collected. So I hope I've been able to convey my love for this title in a fun, engaging way, and perhaps even enhanced your own appreciation for it, or convince you to either give it a go for the first time if you haven't played it before, or another shot if you bounced off it on your first attempt. Because if you can get past the hard exterior, perhaps no game will reward you more. So that's all I had to say on Bloodborne. Thanks for listening. But I do want to, as I promised, update my NFL playoff brackets from as an addendum to this podcast, which is stemming from the podcast that I recorded last week with my cousin Brett. So let me pull that up here and give you an updated bracket. So again, this is not based on, I'm not changing my the teams that I picked to get to the playoffs, but I am changing the bracket because I realized that I screwed up the matchups or screwed up the seeds based on my predictions whenever I was going through that with Brett. So here's the upgraded version. I'll go ahead and do the NFC first. So my NFC bracket in round one puts the Eagles versus the Commanders, the Vikings versus the Buccaneers, and the Packers versus the Cardinals. So for those matchups, I'm going to go with the Eagles over the Commanders, the Buccaneers over the Vikings, because I think that they're just going to choke here, and I'm going to go with the Packers over the Cardinals. So for round two, that puts the Buccaneers up against the Lions and the Packers up against the Eagles. I'm going to go with the Lions over the Buccaneers because they just seem unstoppable right now. And I'm going to go with the Packers over the Eagles because while the Eagles are playing well, I do think that they are probably going to choke. And I think the Packers are more of a team to sort of rise to the occasion than the Eagles. So that puts the Packers versus the Lions for the NFC Conference Championship. And, we have seen the Lions go up against the Packers already this year. The Lions won. I think that is what's going to happen again in the conference championship. Lions make it to the Super Bowl for the NFC. In the AFC for round one, I have the Bills versus the Bengals. I have the Steelers versus the Ravens, and I have the Chargers versus the Texans. So as much as I would love to pick the Bengals, it would be irresponsible for me to pick them over the Bills. So I am going to have to go with the Bills and sadly eliminate the Bengals in round one. I am going to go with the Ravens over the Steelers, like I said before, and I am going to go with the Chargers over the Texans. They just seem like the more consistent team at this point. So for round two, I had the Bills versus the Ravens and the Chargers versus the Chiefs. I've got to go with the Bills over the Ravens. Again, they're just the more consistent team, and they're the one team that's beaten the Chiefs so far this year. And then I've got to go with the Chiefs over the Chargers. The Chargers are great, but I just don't think that they can match up against the Chiefs. So that puts the conference championship as the Bills versus the Chiefs. And like we've seen in the playoffs in years past, even though the Bills beat the Chiefs earlier this year, I just don't know if they can get it done in the playoffs with under the brightest lights and the most pressure. I'm going to go Chiefs. And so that puts the Super Bowl as the Chiefs versus the Lions. And as good and consistent as the Chiefs are, I just, with the teams that they've just barely been able to beat, like the Panthers most recently, and then the Raiders just a couple days ago, where you had the Lions just absolutely stomping teams like that, I've got to pick the Lions to win their first Super Bowl. That's my prediction here. So that is my updated NFL bracket. So thanks for listening to that and bearing with me as I learn the bracket rules for the playoffs in the NFL. But that's the show for this week. Thank you, as always, for listening. You can write into the podcast at controlledburns with an es@gmail.com if you want to send in your own thoughts on Bloodborne or suggestions for other games for me to dissect next. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, follow, like, review, whatever you can do to where you listen to your podcasts. And until next time, remember to keep it warm. Thank you.